So I want to talk again today. We talk a lot about acceptance. It's just so central to this path. I want to take a little deeper dive into it this morning, just because it is so important, and it is the antidote to all things that we seem experience as unpleasant. So anything that's unpleasant, we struggle with accepting it typically, and as we often, and avoidance is really a problem because it keeps us from facing life as it is, not as we want it to be. Avoidance keeps us from accepting the sorrows of life, not just the joys of life. We don't have a problem accepting the joys of life, but we certainly have a tendency to want to avoid the sorrows. And I don't need to tell you that we suffer pain and suffering, psychological, physical, either of which can be debilitating. But I want to focus today more on avoidance of psychological, emotional pain, unpleasant memories, unpleasant thoughts, urges, sensations, emotions, thoughts, the whole range of unpleasant, psychologically unpleasant or emotionally unpleasant experiences. We think about things, we worry about them, we resent them, we become reactive to them, we anticipate negative, unpleasant things, we dread them. But the problem is when we try to avoid them or get rid of them, and the Buddhists brilliantly saw this, it only further entangles us in them and has the potential to even make them something traumatic. So by trying to avoid discomfort and pain, it only gets us in a wrestling match with it. It only, as I said, entangles us. But that's only half the story. I want to also acknowledge that, we're capable of the flip side of the suffering. I mean, we're capable of courage, compassion, keep going even under difficult circumstances. We don't stop loving people just because we can be hurt. We don't stop loving people just because we know we can lose them. Despite all the adversity, we remain alive, we remain committed. But that aside, and it's important, it's just not the focus for today. We know that we evolved to avoid that which is painful or dangerous. Rick Hanson, psychologist and Dharma teacher who wrote Buddha's Brain, reminds us that our minds are Velcro for the negative and Teflon for the positive, meaning that our survival depended on this bias. We evolved, the evolution selected for this, because a false positive, thinking that there's a tiger, having a bias to see danger when there isn't, it's not dangerous. It's just a mistake. Whereas a false negative, thinking there's no danger when there is one, is fatal. So we tend to say, okay, we think, oh, there's a saber-toothed tiger in the bush. He's not there, no problem. The saber-toothed tiger is not in the bush. He is there. We're done. Okay, so evolution selected to have us have this false negative bias, this tendency toward negativity. So that's what we're up against in terms of our practice. Another way to think about it is that we avoid that which is psychological threatening, even though it's not necessarily dangerous or fatal, but it's just uncomfortable, because that's where this bias takes us. It takes us, our brains are predisposed to go to the negative, and we're a little less inclined to go to the positive. And I would suggest to you, based on my many years as a psychologist, that the avoidance of painful emotions, trying to avoid them, is one of the primary sources of psychological disturbance. We know that avoidance, what we call experiential avoidance in my field, meaning trying to avoid unpleasant thoughts, feelings, experiences, is one of the primary sources of psychological disturbance. It's a primary source of suffering. So what is it we don't accept? Good gosh, the list is huge. Aging, loss of youthful vigor, conflicts with others, disagreements, past failures, regrets, old resentments, financial stress, our mortality, unmet goals. It goes on and on. And as I said, the Buddha brilliantly figured this out 2,600 years ago. He was just an amazingly insightful a human being. And what he said was, and the fundamental teaching here is that transformation happens when suffering is known. Transformation happens when suffering is known. In other words, when we move toward it, when we acknowledge it, when we embrace it, when we accept and face and lean into our suffering, into our anxiety, into our fear, into the scary places, there's paradoxically, there's freedom in that. It's when we try to avoid it and run away from it and distract from it that we suffer. Okay. I know that sounds paradoxical, but we know from thousands of years of Buddhism and hundreds of years of psychology that it's true. So the Dharma teaches us to lean into that direction, to shine a light into the corners of the dark corners of our experience that we prefer not to look at. In other words, to avoid. Facing that, which we want to turn away from, looking at it, leaning into it with compassion and without judgment, and that's critical. We lean into it. We lean into those dark places, but we do it with compassion and we do it without self-judgment, is the path to freedom. That is a central, fundamental, primary teaching that this path offers us. So in doing that, we shift from this judgmental stance, this attempt to control our internal experience, to accepting it with compassion and without judgment. So I don't like, feeling anxious, okay, for example. So I can get in a wrestling match with it, try to distract from it, run from it, avoid it. Or I can accept it with compassion. I can accept it without judgment, and lo and behold, it will dissipate. But if I'm struggling with it, if I'm wrestling with it, if I'm fighting with it, I'm going to lose. I'm going to get more anxious. It's just that basic. This is from Lao Tzu, the Taoist. He says, quote, "Life is a series of natural and spontaneous changes. Don't resist them. That only creates sorrow. Let reality be reality. Let things flow naturally forward in whatever way they like." What is he saying? He's talking about acceptance. Okay. Another quote. This is from Ajahn Sumedho, who is an American-born Theravadan Buddhist monk. He was asked at a retreat, what is the essence of the Buddha's teaching? And his answer was, let go, let go, let go. Okay. The essence of the Buddha's teaching. In other words, acceptance. He's talking about there, let go of our attempts to control and push away and avoid that which we don't like. True freedom comes from accepting what the Taoists call the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows of this life. Life is, they talked about 10,000 joys and 10,000 sorrows. We can't just have the joys without the sorrows. It's part of the deal. And remembering that pain and suffering, we talked about this last month, are two separate things, the two arrows. Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. Suffering is all the baggage we load onto our pain, all the judgment, all the self-criticism, all the self-loathing that we put on it. Okay. And as we talked about last week, we cannot control what happens to us, but we can control, well, most of the time, but we can control how we respond to what happens to us. That's the beauty, that's the essence of this practice. We can't control all that happens to us, but we can certainly control how we respond to it. So for example, not identifying with our pain, saying, is one way to accept it because it ceases to be about us. When we get identified with it, when we make it part of who we are, then that just merges us with it. As the Buddha taught, accepting our suffering is a step toward lessening our suffering. It sounds paradoxical, but that's the roadmap that he provided us. Accepting our suffering is the path of reducing our suffering. The other thing about acceptance is, and another reason it leads to freedom, is because it makes us much more resilient. When we're open to it, as uncomfortable as it is, we embrace it all, we're just more nimble on our feet. We're not so rigidly shut down trying to control everything and trying to just control it. We can't do that. By accepting it, we stay open. Okay, emotional rigidity, trying to control it, inflexibility, is the cause of so many psychological problems. People come in contracted, shut down, trying to control and micromanage their experience. That is a sure formula for suffering. And with acceptance, we don't expend all this energy, waste all this energy trying to avoid stuff. I mean, we can just tie ourselves in knots trying to avoid that which is unpleasant. I mean, we do countless things. We overeat, we overexercise, we overspend. We engage in all kinds. We overdrink, we overdrug, we have too much, meaningless sex. I mean, we do all these things to try to avoid, and it just shuts us down. It just distracts us. So with acceptance, we're open to whatever life hands us, which is true freedom. When I'm open to whatever comes in my way, like it or not, that's the formula for freedom. Because the opposite of not doing that, the opposite of not opening to all experiences, is to contract, avoid, deny. We move. The challenge is to move from resistance in all those forms to life as it is. That's the true meaning of acceptance. That's the true path to freedom. And versus trying to control. So that's been a theme lately, but I wanted to sort of delve a little more deeply today into acceptance. And let me leave it there, and let's have some discussion.